So I thought we'd start with a few basic Excel stuff. You should have taken Business 195 or AB 190. It's the same course. That is basically an Excel-based course where you're supposed to be able to understand how to use Excel, all those fun things. So what I have here is a workbook, which I have not saved or titled anything special. It's called Book 1. And within this workbook, I have two worksheets. One I have labeled a worksheet called If, and I have a second worksheet which I've labeled SUMPRODUCT. Those are two functions in Excel that I want to look at. That's why I labeled those worksheets those names. So let's look at those two functions, and then we'll look at some other stuff as we go through this small little video as well. So here in the first worksheet, which is again labeled If, I have some time series data where I have column A. Columns are labeled with letters. Rows are things that go horizontal and are labeled with numbers. So in column A, I have the year. I have 2 years worth of data, 1999 and the year 2000. And I have quarterly data. So quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4 for 1999, same for 2000. Then the variable of interest is the international tourist visitor nights in Australia, in millions of tourist nights, visitor nights, overnight stays, right? So when we get to time series analysis much later on in unit 4 or 5, I forget exactly, then we will be doing this kind of stuff a lot. So I want to talk about it now, so hopefully it sinks in. One of the things that we want to do is create dummy variables, which is just a dummy variable is a 0 or 1, also called an indicator variable. And the easiest way, or one way to do it, so it's somewhat dynamic and can change if I add stuff, is to use an if statement. So an if then statement or if else statement can be used in Excel. So here what I'm interested in is, does row 2 belong to quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, or quarter 4? So I would like to be able to label 3 new variables, call it Q1, Q2, and Q3, to indicate whether or not those are, so those rows fall into the first quarter, second quarter, or third quarter. So obviously the first row does fall into the first quarter, but I want to use an if statement to figure this out. So remember, you start formulas in Excel with an equal sign, so I'm going to go ahead and type equal, and it's just the word if, and notice I get a tooltip that pops up when I do this. And the first one I want is if. It checks whether a condition is met and returns one value of true and another of false. That is what I want. We have an open parenthesis, the logical test. So I'm going to point to B2, click it. If that is equal to quarter 1, then return a 1, saying yes. That's the same thing as saying yes, comma, else the value if it's false, I'm going to put a 0 there. Right. So it returned a 1 because B2 contained the string quarter 2. Notice that I put within equal to within double quotes here because this is a string or text within cell B2. I want to do something similar for column E. If B2 equals quarter 2, return a 1, else return a 0. So when I hit enter, what should we see? Should see a 0 because it's not in quarter 2, it's in quarter 1. We just saw that. Same thing with quarter 3. If B2 is equal to quarter 3, return a 1, forgot the double quote, return a 1, else return a 0. And we have right there a 1, 0, 0. So then what I want to do is I want to auto fill this down. I used relative reference B2, so it's always going to, so when I drag it down, this formula down the next rows, it'll keep it relative, so it'll go to B3, etc. So I can highlight all three of those, move my mouse over until I get a black plus sign, and double click. And it auto fills it down. So notice that the third row, which is 1990 quarter 2, 19.1485, there's a 1 because it's in quarter 2. Next one is a 1 in quarter 3. Notice that for quarter 4, that's all zeros because it's not in quarter 1, it's not in quarter 2, it's not in quarter 3. Hence, it has to be in quarter 4. And then we see the same pattern, this diagonal pattern going for that. So that's a simple if statement. The other thing you can always do too is up here on the little f of x, it's the insert function button, right? Because I already had an if statement in here. It does all this for me. But what you can also do is click help on this function, and it brings up the Microsoft Excel 2016 help. Talks you through what the if function does, right? Gives an example, all that fun stuff. So actually, it's a pretty big example, which is pretty good. Right? So that's always a good way to figure out how to use a function if you don't know how to use it. So that's an if statement. The other big function that we will use later on in the course in units 5 and 6 is the SUMPRODUCT function. So for this I thought, hey, why not go ahead and calculate your grade for the course? So we have the different categories. We have the project idea that's worth 10%. Go back and look at the syllabus. This is all in the syllabus. Quizzes, 10%. Excel assignments, 20%. Exam 1, 20%. Exam 2, 20%. Final exam, 20%. And then finally, I want to calculate your final numeric grade and then translate that to a letter grade, all that fun stuff. So one thing that you can do in Excel that's very handy, that's not a function or anything, but what I want to do is I just want to select all of these weights, the 10%. Notice I put it in as a fraction instead of percentage. What I really want to do is do something like this. So it's not the percentage. So I hit the percentage button. I just formatted it. So when I add all those up, it ought to add to 100%. I can go down to the very bottom of Excel, and I see here it tells me a count, it tells me the average, and the sum, 100%. Woo! Adds up properly. That's what I want. Right? So now what a sum product does is simply a weighted average. Right? So how do you calculate your grade for this course? You should be able to do this. Right? So let's say for your project idea you got a 90%. Quizzes, the best 5 out of 6, you got an 87%. Excel assignments, best 4 out of 5, you got an 83%. Exam 1, you bombed and got a 65. Exam 2, you did a little bit better, you got a 70. And the final exam, you got a 72. All right. So how do I find your final numeric grade? Well, I take the 10%, multiply times 90, gives me 9. Add to it 10% of 87. So now I'm up to 9 plus 8.7, 17.7. 20% of 83, 20% of 65, 20% of 70, 20% of 72. Add them all up. All right. So I could do that out in a nice long formula, right, where I say this times this plus the 10% times the 87, etc., etc. That's pretty boring and tedious. Instead, Excel has a built-in function called SUMPRODUCT. Takes in arrays. So we put the first array, which are the weights. I'm going to hit F4 to make it absolute reference, fixing it to those numbers, comma, and the next array are the actual grades for those courses, or for those assignments. Close parenthesis, and I see that your overall final numeric grade for the course is 75.7%. Good job, you got a C. All right, you passed the course. All right. Now that was student 1. Student 2, let's say they really just didn't do any work at all on the project idea, and I gave them a 35%. Quizzes, they did better. They got 90%. Excel assignments, they worked hard and got a 95. Exam 1, they just blew out of the water and got a 98. Exam 2, because they were so overconfident after exam 1, they actually did really poorly and got a 56. And then the final exam, they got their act back together and ended up with an 86. Right? So now I can copy this formula down because I anchored the weights up here. And now notice that the red part is pointing to there. And this person has a higher final numeric grade of a 79.5. Right? So let's see, what is that? B minus? Something like that. So did better than that guy. And still doing halfway decent, right? Passing the course, getting overconfident at points, things like that. So that's the sum product function. We're going to be using the sum product along with the sum function when we get to linear programming and an integer programming, the last two units of the course. So we need to know what those are for. But in essence, it's a weighted average. Again, if you have trouble with one of these, right, what you can do is you can go to the help function and see what it says about it, right? And talks about which arrays and what all that fun, good stuff is about it. So those are two functions that we are going to use later on in the course, but are vitally important and should help you remember how to get there. One final thing I want to talk about before ending this little video is just simply looking at all of the formulas within a worksheet. On a Windows machine, don't expect me to know anything about Macs, I held down the control key and I hit the grave accent or tilde key, which is usually the key above the tab key next to the number 1 on your keyboard. When I do that, and we scroll over, we see that it shows all of the formulas that are in the worksheet. And then I hit it again, same keystroke sequence, control tilde, to see that. And over here, we're going to see a lot more formulas because we have them for all of those 3 columns and those 8 rows. Right? So that's a good way to see all the formulas within a worksheet. So some of the other stuff, if you read through the basics of Excel document, that should give you some other basic stuff. And then there's helpful stuff on the web too with Microsoft's help or support pages for Excel. It does often break it down, almost always, by the version of Excel you're using. You should be using 2016, and whether it's a Windows or a Mac. So how I made the first array here absolute with the dollar signs by hitting F4 on my computer because it's a Windows machine. You cannot do that on a Mac. It's Command T, I believe, on a Macintosh. If you have F4 on a Windows machine and it doesn't work, then you might have to hold down the function key and then hit F4. Right? Hold down, yep, same time, and do that. So there's some very basic Excel stuff that should get you through the stuff that we need for right now.